If you're looking for an electric vehicle and you don't want a battery electric vehicle, at the moment you have two options in the US, as long as you live in California or in Hawaii. We have the Toyota Mirai over here on this side and the Hyundai Nexo on this side. They're both fuel cell hydrogen vehicles. This is the Nexo that I have been driving for about 2 years so far, and this is the all-new and much sexier Toyota Mirai. This is absolutely gorgeous, and this is now the most powerful hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, the longest range hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, the most fun hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, and the only rear-wheel drive model available. Be sure and let me know what you think about the styling on these two vehicles down there in the comment section. I think this is quite simply the most attractive Toyota sedan that they currently make. I would love to see, for instance, this becoming maybe a Toyota Avalon at some point in the future. The Nexo over here definitely is futuristic with this large LED strip right across the front, and this is one of the first Hyundai vehicles that had this particular grille design on it. Hyundai has decided that not all their vehicles need to look alike, so even though we see similar shapes in here to other Hyundai models, it doesn't exactly look like one of the family all the time. Moving around the vehicle, the Nexo is a little bit shorter. This is about the same size as a Nissan Rogue, whereas the Mirai is about the same size as the Avalon. And obviously, this has more of a crossover or hatchback vibe going to it. We have pop-out door handles that retract when the vehicle is locked for better aerodynamics there. And then we have this interesting style right here where there's actually a little duct right here. Air comes through there, out the back. It helps improve aerodynamics as well. And then we have a somewhat plain hatch in the rear. It's a little bit bubbly here with full LED tail lights. They have kind of a geometric crystal-y design going on there. Dual exhaust is an interesting touch in the Nexo. The only byproduct for a fuel cell vehicle like this is water and air, but it does actually have dual exhaust, which is an interesting twist. Moving over here to the Mirai, we have a LED strip that runs across the back as well. Much more traditional sedan styling and sort of an homage, I guess you could say, to dual exhaust right down there at the bottom of the bumper. The Mirai definitely has the bigger wheels. These are 20-inch wheels, and I really love the design. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. This also has pretty decently sized tires, 245 width tires, same width that we find in the Nexo, but these are 245 40R20s, so they're definitely a big wheel and tire combo. In an odd sort of way, both the rear-wheel drive sedan look and the crossover look make sense for fuel cell vehicles. Fuel cells are a little bit on the large side compared to a small 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, for instance, although this fuel cell under the hood of the Nexo is just about the size of a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine. You can see it's a little on the tall side, so the higher hood height that we find in the Nexo is definitely an advantage for stuffing this fuel cell under here. The Nexo has one of the first fuel cells in the world that was designed to sit entirely under the hood of the vehicle. In the previous generation Mirai, the fuel cell wasn't just under the hood, it was also under the passenger compartment of the vehicle. But things are very different over here in the Mirai. This is the absolute latest generation fuel cell. This is significantly more energy dense than the one that we find in the Nexo. Energy density is nearly double the Hyundai fuel cell, and power output is about 30% higher as well. But you can see that it's still physically fairly large. So basing this vehicle off of the Lexus LS platform made sense, because that was designed for twin-turbo 6s, and of course the 5-liter V8 that we find in the Lexus lineup in the Lexus LC, which is also related to this vehicle. So the fuel cell here is now entirely under the hood, and we have an electric motor in the back. 182 horsepower in the Mirai, 221 pound-feet of torque versus 161 horsepower and 291 pound-feet of torque in the Nexo. Now, on the surface of things, it would appear that performance in these two vehicles should be equally matched. 161 horsepower, 182 horsepower, but more torque in the Nexo. And the Nexo is actually a little bit lighter than this vehicle. Remember, the Mirai is based on the Lexus LS platform, a vehicle that wasn't necessarily designed from the beginning to be a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, so it just ends up being a little bit heavier. But there's an important thing that you should keep in mind. The fuel cell stack produces more oomph. And remember, this is an electric vehicle, so what's driving the motor ultimately is the fuel cell stack, not the electric motor itself. It obviously can't generate its own electricity. And the fuel cell stack under here produces 95 kilowatts. This one produces 128. So once the relatively small battery pack that's in the back of both of these vehicles is exhausted, and it doesn't really take too much time in the 0 to 60 run to do that, you're left with what the fuel cell can generate. And this one is producing a lot more power. The filling experience is nearly identical in both vehicles. There's a filler port on the driver's side rear of the vehicle. You simply connect the hydrogen filler nozzle at your local friendly hydrogen station. There are only about 60 of them or so in the United States. And then filling takes about 5 minutes. 5 minutes of filling will get you 380 miles in the longest range Nexo, 354 miles if you get the top end trim because it has wider tires, and up to 402 miles of range in the Mirai. Again, Things will vary based on the options. Both of these vehicles, however, will definitely go the EPA stated range. I have had absolutely no problem getting way over 350 miles in my Nexo, even though this one is rated for 354. This one will definitely do 380, 390 miles, no problem. You can easily drive this Nexo from the San Francisco Bay Area to Los Angeles, then you can top it off, drive down to San Diego, go all the way back to Santa Barbara, top it off, kick it back on into the Bay Area, and still have enough fuel to drive around for a few commute cycles, etc. Absolutely no problem in a fuel cell vehicle. And that is the big advantage versus an electric vehicle, a battery electric vehicle. Some of the longest range battery electric vehicles we have now will theoretically do about 300 miles of real world range. The Ford Mustang Mach-E, which is an affordable one, the one that we currently have here at Alex and Autos for a long-term test, it's rated at 270. 290 if you treat it nicely. But it's worth noting that in colder weather, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles perform a lot better. And it's not just because these have heat pumps on board, it's because they're not heating a battery. And a decent amount of energy is not only expended heating the battery, but also dealing with the fact that when batteries are cold, they don't produce as much oomph. With the longer range, you might think that the Mirai holds more hydrogen, but you'd actually be wrong. 5.6 kilograms in this vehicle, around 11 pounds of hydrogen or so. The Nexo holds 6.33 kilograms, right around 14 pounds of hydrogen. The reason is the Mirai is quite simply more aerodynamic. You can tell with its sleeker profile, and that's why this is a little bit more efficient. It also has the latest generation fuel cell stack, which is more efficient than the fuel cell stack that we find in the Nexo. Although Toyota has been a little bit cagey about efficiency numbers on this vehicle, it does appear that the fuel cell stack itself has really improved in terms of its efficiency versus the previous generation fuel cell technology that we find in the Nexo, the Clarity, or of course the previous generation Mirai. Although I suppose when you think about it, that statement is not as exciting as it sounds because there are only two hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, so clearly one has to be better than the other, right? Well, this Nexo over here is a very different kind of fuel cell vehicle. It's a front-wheel drive vehicle. It's built on a more or less unique platform. It is related to other Hyundai vehicles, but not as directly related as the Mirai is, interestingly enough. This is obviously trying to be a crossover. I guess you could call this more of a pregnant hatchback since all-wheel drive is not an option on the Nexo, but back here, we have a power hatch, just as you'd expect in a crossover. When I leased the Nexo about 2 years ago, there weren't too many EV options that had decently sized cargo areas or cargo areas that were as square as this. And that is the big reason that I ended up with this particular option. Now, over here in the Mirai, things are quite different. This is longer, it's sleeker, it has the rear-wheel drive proportion that you'd expect, a considerably longer wheelbase. The front tire is pushed all the way to the front. We have that long hood up there, and then we have a bit of a sportback profile going on here, but we don't have a liftback like you'd find in an Audi A7. Instead, we have a traditional hood with a fairly small cargo area, just over 9 cubic feet back here. This is about 1/3 the size of the cargo area in the Nexo. Neither vehicle gives you a spare tire, but there are a few extra knickknacks under the load floor. The interior design of these two vehicles could not be more different if they had tried. The Nexo is definitely trying to be very futuristic looking in a Hyundai sort of way. So we have a 2-spoke steering wheel that we're finding in a lot of Hyundai and Genesis models, some big LCDs in the dash. We have a fairly small instrument cluster that's actually been upgraded for 2022. We get a bigger instrument cluster, but we get the exact same touchscreen LCD here in the center. And then, of course, every single button that every other car company has excised from their interior, Hyundai has tracked down and then relocated right here in this massive button center console. We have buttons for the infotainment system, we have buttons for the climate control system, buttons for the shifters, a whole bunch of buttons, and a knob for that touchscreen infotainment system, because you can either touch the screen or you can use the knob. We also have the latest in trendy automotive designs, a floating center console where you can put purses, phones, things like that. There's also a Qi wireless charging mat down there, but oddly enough, not the best cup holders. We have one round cup holder right here in the center console, and then one over here on the dashboard, which reminds me an awful lot of 1990s Saabs. The Mirai's interior is also very modern, but with definitely a different twist than we see in the Nexo. Toyota has gone for a lot of black gloss parts rather than the shinier silver sections that we see in the Nexo. We have a big LCD infotainment system here borrowed out of the Highlander, and then a 7-inch instrument cluster behind the steering wheel. The steering wheel itself looks a little bit like what we see in the Lexus LS. Makes sense since this is related. In the dashboard, we have controls that are pretty similar to other Toyota and Lexus products, and then a joystick-style shifter like we find in the Prius. There's definitely a better cup holder game going on in this interior, but below the center console, no additional storage is happening because one of the hydrogen tanks is basically right about here in the vehicle, and that's why we have a big hump in the back, and also a fairly wide center console. Jumping into the back, you'll definitely notice the different dimensions versus the Nexo. The rear seats are a little bit more reclined. There's a lot less headroom. My head actually touches the ceiling if I try and put my head back there, and if I lean forward, it's really bumping on this section. We have a larger panoramic moonroof in here, but it really cuts down on headroom. There's definitely less legroom, and you can really see the size of this hump between the two rear seats. That's again where the hydrogen tank is located. That means that if I were to try and get into this center seat, it is a little bit tricky. And if this front seat was all the way back in its tracks, I wouldn't actually be able to do that because the seat back would be nearly touching there. And there's just no way that I could ever get my head back there to that headrest. Oh, well, maybe I can. Front seat comfort in the Nexo is pretty good, and headroom is fairly generous. This model has a moonroof. It's a pretty standard size moonroof. I have about 1.5 inches of headroom left. But the big win for the Nexo versus the Mirai is the back seat. Not only do I have more headroom back here, I have tons more legroom, several inches more, and I have an actual usable fifth seat in the middle where I can sit upright. I have about 1 inch of headroom left, my knees aren't touching the seats, and it's not weirdly projecting forward. The interior in here is a very normal 5-seat crossover, and there's barely any hump right there in the floor. That's because the hydrogen tanks are entirely under the cargo area. As you'd logically expect, the cargo area is a little bit cozier in the Mirai. With just under 10 cubic feet of cargo space, you'll find a lot more storage room in the Nexo. The Mirai is certainly the more fun of these two vehicles to drive. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 7.4 seconds. This is the fastest hydrogen vehicle ever built so far. The Nexo in 8.8 seconds. It's about as fast as the average compact crossover with a CVT like a Nissan Rogue or even certain versions of the Toyota RAV4. But more important than the quick 0 to 60 time, the Mirai feels better balanced, more planted. The center of gravity is a little bit lower because it's a sedan. And because of the design of a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle like this, it has a perfect 50-50 weight balance when you put the motor in the rear. The motor is relatively heavy, but the fuel cell stack balances it out up front, and the hydrogen tanks, even though they're a little bit on the weighty side, they are in the rear, and that helps move some of the weight to the back as well. As far as curb weight goes, the Mirai is actually a little bit heavier than the Nexo, and we have similar tires on these vehicles, but because of the better weight balance, handling is more predictable, it's more enjoyable, it's just more fun in the Mirai. And because this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you can actually get the rear end to step out a little bit if you're more aggressive on the throttle. But as far as tire spinning goes, the Nexo wins that race because it has a great deal more torque than we find in this vehicle, and of course it's on the front tires, so it's easy to get some front wheel spin in that model. One of the things that I really like about the Nexo that we don't find in the Mirai are the paddles, the regen paddles on the back of the steering wheel. That allows you to select the level of regen braking that you get. Both of these vehicles offer braking regeneration, but it's not adjustable in the Mirai in the same way. We have the BR mode here on this shifter, just like we find in the Prius, that gives you a bit more aggressive regen, but you can never put this into a sailing mode, and you can never get as aggressive as we find in that Nexo. That particular feature is one that I ended up liking a great deal more than I thought I would when I first leased the Nexo, but it's a definite feature that I use every time I'm in the car. As you'd expect out of the sedan that has a bit of a sportier vibe compared to the Nexo, the ride quality in the Mirai is just a little bit firmer. Both of these are still very comfortable, very daily driver livable, and certainly vehicles that fit my personality, but if I were simply choosing a vehicle based on ride quality, it would be the Nexo. The suspension system in the Hyundai gets a little bit more upset over broken pavement. It's very, very well sorted, but it's not the same level of polish that we see in the Mirai. The Mirai is based off of, yet again, I keep saying this, I know, but the Lexus LS. And that really bodes well for this vehicle because Lexus has some of the best suspension tuning in the luxury segment, and all that really does translate directly down to the Mirai. The front suspension and the rear suspension design of this vehicle are excellent. It has a perfect 50-50 weight balance. Everything about this vehicle is exactly where it would need to be for a luxury hydrogen vehicle, and that's probably why the rumor mill is telling us that there might be a Lexus version of this soon. Cabin quietness is pretty similar between these two vehicles. They got exactly the same score in the cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, and both of these vehicles have that definite fuel cell sound to them. It's a lot more muted in the Mirai than the first generation. If I push on the accelerator pedal, you get just a little bit of that whooshing sound from the blower that's part of the fuel cell stack. When the vehicle is parked, you'll hear some of that humming and ticking from the fuel cell stack. There's some valves in there that are controlling the release of the hydrogen, and of course a blower that's blowing air into the fuel cell stack. That's how the oxygen ends up in there for the reaction. Now, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles do not burn hydrogen. I guess you could call it sort of a catalyst style reaction. There's a proton exchange membrane in there, and protons are logically exchanged. That helps create the electrical charge on either side of the fuel fuel cell stack, and that gives us the electricity. If you want to know more about how hydrogen fuel cells work, there are a lot of videos online that go into great detail about their function, but bottom line, fuel cells don't get terribly hot. There's not a lot of extra heat going on, and that's why they're not using the fuel cell stack to help heat the cabin. For cabin heating, we have a heat pump like we find in more expensive electric vehicles. That's one of the reasons that winter weather operation is a little bit more efficient in here than in some electric vehicles as well. Bottom lining these two vehicles out on the road is pretty easy. The Mirai is clearly the more fun vehicle to drive, but I think that the Nexo is actually a little bit more comfortable for longer road journeys. As far as efficiency goes, clearly the Mirai has to win here. 400 miles on less hydrogen is definitely more efficient than the Nexo. The Nexo will go nearly 400 miles, but it will take a little bit more hydrogen to get there. Clearly, it's time for me to pick a winner in this telephone booth-sized segment. One has to win and one has to be runner-up. And the runner-up for me has to be the Toyota Mirai at the moment, mainly due to practicality. The Mirai is unquestionably more fun to drive. It's faster, it handles better than the Nexo, it's a little bit quieter. I like the way that this feels out on the road. And because it's based on a rear-wheel drive Lexus, the steering and the suspension design is absolutely dialed in. It feels really, really great. The bad part is the practicality. The rear seats are just not that comfortable for adults. The cargo area is pretty small. And over here in the Nexo, this is exactly what American shoppers seem to be asking for. A pregnant hatchback or a crossover, whatever you want to call it. It even has roof rails on top. It has a pretty decently sized cargo area. And even though we don't find a spare tire in the trunk, if I pop this power hatch, which is powered, which is another nice touch, there's actually a little bit of additional storage space right back here. So you can put things like the tire mobility kit. You can leave that there. Spare jackets, first aid kits, etc. All that can actually be stored right back there in the cargo area, and you have the additional storage space. And the rear seats fold. So if you wanted to go to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever and get some home improvement stuff, you can do that in the Nexo. This could be the easy replacement in an alternative fueled format to a Hyundai Tucson or a Toyota RAV4. Whereas the Mirai, I guess, could replace your Avalon or your Camry, but interior room is going to be a little bit more limited than you might think because of the rear-wheel drive dimensions. The Avalon is a lot roomier on the inside, and the Avalon and Camry are going to be more practical, generally speaking, because their rear seats fold down and the trunk is a little bit bigger. But the range is really hard to beat, and the Mirai is definitely good looking. So if you're looking for one of the most unique vehicles on the planet that really separates you from the crowd, definitely take a look at both of these vehicles. The deals going on the Mirai are pretty extreme right now, and the Mirai pricing is excellent. Also keep in mind that the hydrogen is included in both of these vehicles for the entire lease period and the miles on your lease, or if you buy one, it's basically $15,000 until that expires. Be sure and check out all the other videos on these two vehicles on the channel. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, the merch store, and I'll see all of you next week.